First, I'm going to welcome Jane Dixon, who's Associate Professor and Senior Fellow at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the Australian National University. She's here in London, as I said, as a Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor and based here. And for 13 years, she's been conducting research at the intersection of sociology and public health, with a focus on the cultural, social and health impacts of food system transformations. Before that, she was the National Coordinator of the Health Inequalities Research Collaboration, helping to establish the International Society for Equity in Health. In recent applied research, she's been an advisor to the WHO Western Pacific Regional Office and is a visiting research fellow with the International Institute for Global Health. And the title of her presentation is Health and Wellbeing in Our Ecologically Constrained World. What are the prospects for gender inequity?
The title that Rebecca just read out is slightly different to the one. I've become more ambitious than that title, and that title was quite ambitious enough. My talk is in 3 parts, and they are not necessarily connected, but I'm going to try and make some tenuous links between them. The first part is going to be a summary of the article that was led by a colleague here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Helen Walls. I'm going to say something about the history behind the article. It appears in this journal, and I'm going to say quite a lot about this journal, which is the International Journal of Feminist Approaches to Bioethics, and they've just done a special issue on food. I've got references at the end of the presentation, but it is an absolutely wonderful issue for people interested in the ethical dimensions to this topic. I'm then going to try and illustrate some of the dimensions that are highly conceptual in the paper, talking about a locally based intervention in Bangladesh and some of the gender dynamics that are ongoing there. I think that part of the talk, for those of you who heard Deborah Johnson, may resonate with you. I'm then actually going to take it up again to a more conceptual level, but talk about some of the methodological, epistemological tools if we want to do research in this space. This lovely French term of bricolage, a bricoleur, is somebody who tries to assemble from various different materials a whole. As I say, this is in 3 parts. It absolutely reflects, and I hope this isn't arrogant of me, but it absolutely reflects my last 15 years or so of working. Rebecca mentioned my time as a national coordinator in Australia of the Health Inequalities Research Collaboration. I'm very much embedded in this social determinants of health field. I'm sure many of you will have heard about the work of Michael Marmot and the Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. Well, we had a very vibrant undertaking along those lines in Australia. I'm going to talk about now, which is really where I'm doing a lot of research, thinking at least, on the intersection between household food insecurity and livelihoods, both in the developing and developed world. And then I'm going to take it up a notch, and I've written a book review, it isn't out yet, in the Journal of Peasant Studies on critical nutrition and what does that consist of, and I'm going to bring some of that thinking to bear. So part A of the talk very much addresses this women's positioning in what we could call eco-social structures. And what this part of the talk really does is to say how difficult it is to bring about social change, and I think the limited utility of many local interventions, but maybe Kate will take me on there. Part B is a much more applied example, and then where I'm talking about trying to reframe how we think about food systems and women's and men's place in food systems as a global change strategy, because we have to acknowledge that our mental maps, our mental ways of thinking, they're crossing borders all the time. And when we hear about the westernization of diets or the way China is influencing trade flows, etc., we really are talking globally. So here is the first part of the talk. Now, how many of you are familiar with this social determinants of health field? Couple hesitantly will look good. That's good. What I'm drawing heavily on this article that I co-authored in here, led by Helen Walls at this point, and so you can read about it if it all gets too dense and confusing. Really what we say is we can think about health, well-being, women's position, in terms of two streams of thinking. And one of them is the neoliberal emphasis on the free individual being a rational actor, maximising choices, and we really celebrate, according to that line of argument, notions of self-reliance, the autonomous subject, and personal responsibility. Now, this must resonate for you in the whole health promotion, nutrition education campaigns. They are all within that framing. That if, in fact, if we could just teach people about nutrition, they will then go out automatically as rational beings and enact that choice for healthy eating. Really looming after the Second World War, however, was a different emphasis, and it became enshrined in welfare states in many parts of the world, and this is what we could call the social democratic emphasis on those choices not being freely made, but by being circumscribed by life circumstances, or what we can call chance. So how the paper began, just as an aside, was a small group of us at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health getting around and saying, let's have a debate on chance or choice. Which is more important in determining people's health risks and health outcomes? And some of us stuck with this discussion for 2 years, which is how long it took to write the paper. But here we're saying that, in fact, people's choices, how they act, their food decisions, their participation in the food system more generally, not just as consumers, but as producers, etc., highly constrained by social class, gender, race, place, and era. And by era, I'm talking about the decades in which each of us grow up, and how we absorb the ruling ideas of the time, the way social policies frame our place in the world, the cultural belief systems, how strongly we feel about individualism or social responsibility. And so here we can see small cog in a large system vis-a-vis self-reliance, social hierarchies vis-a-vis autonomy, social or shared responsibility vis-a-vis personal responsibility. They are quite different worldviews. So what epidemiologists did do as part of this debate was to really sharpen our understanding about what gives rise to life chances and choices. So there's much more to this than thinking about income. And I do think too many of us become fixated in the food space with its household incomes, its wealth, its money, its cheap food, its expensive food. There's a whole lot more that goes into what we can call our socio-economic position. And again, traits, dimensions, features of education, gender, caste, age, they all cohere in something called socio-economic position, the SEP. But what the epidemiologists did was to say the distribution of life chances across society creates hierarchies and hence differential health and well-being outcomes. So it is ridiculous to talk about individuals there as autonomous beings acting freely, even if they are rich, well-educated, etc. But they inhabit a system of hierarchies of power and privilege. So there's something called the social gradient of health, social gradient of socioeconomic status. And it's about relativities. It's about not only my income relative to Nadia's, it is also about how I am treated in society, how the laws act for me in society. Whether there is equal opportunity legislation, that's one thing, but is it actually practiced? And we know it's not. And we know from research, it's all cited in the article, that nations with higher socioeconomic inequalities have less social mobility and even more unfair life chances. And we're seeing this very much now, that inequalities are growing in Britain, the US, Australia, and life chances for people along that social gradient towards the bottom of that gradient are becoming even more curtailed. And look, as an aside, we're also seeing that actually countries in this global world of ours, they can actually, by importing people and resources, they can actually export and import life choices and chances. And this is a huge issue in the food system, for example, that in fact we wouldn't have vibrant food systems if we weren't importing cheap labour, unskilled labour from near neighbours. But this is one large constraint on men and women's, and particularly women's, capacity to shape the food system that they want. But equally important, throughout my years of research, ever since my PhD, I've thought that the socio-cultural positioning that we inhabit is as important as the socio-economic. Yes, they are related, but what do I mean by socio-cultural positioning? I'm talking about a society or a subpopulation's norms, rules, sanctions, and the institutional arrangements that actually provide tram tracks or railway tracks to say, this is appropriate, don't jump off the track, that's not appropriate. So ways of thinking, mental mapping, are very important. And what I think is that the lot of women is explained by the way these two interact. It's not just women's earning capacity and her property ownership. This is very important in terms of food production. but it's also in terms of how women are represented in decision-making fora and their vulnerability to gender-based violence, how that is tolerated. Those are just examples of the major guiding forces, social forces that create fairness or unfairness in food systems. And then we talk in that article about how you can actually typify societies in terms of socio-cultural conditions, and hence the risk of being low in your socio-cultural positioning. The article does have 2 vignettes, which I don't have time to go through, but we actually bring to life what I mean by this through talking about a character called Peter, a 78-year-old Australian male living on the northern shore of Sydney, and an 81-year-old woman called Sita from Sri Lanka. One of our team was Sri Lankan. They're composite pictures, they draw on our research, they're not just hypothetical, romanticised, idealised figures. But we talk about how their life chances and choices play out in terms of their positioning both socio-economically and socio-culturally. I'm going to skip that, but no, I'm not. The point of the article was that the current state of inequalities and unfairness in relationship to women's place in societies and in their place in food systems is very likely to be exacerbated. So another member of the team was Colin Butler. He's written several books on climate change and health. He feels very strongly that we are moving into an era, one of the slides that comes up is called peak health, that in fact we're so running out of environmental resources, whether to grow food or just in terms of safe neighbourhoods, safe environments that aren't built on toxic soil, etc., that in resource-constrained times, those who are at the bottom of today's social gradients are actually going to have a harder time than ever before in actually having decent health and well-being outcomes. It's a very pessimistic scenario we paint, but anybody who works with Colin Butler becomes extremely pessimistic. And so what we did start to do is to look at what sorts of societies actually value environmental resource, are willing to protect environmental resources, encourage citizens to protect environmental resources. And there are 2 major studies we drew on, and again, the tightness of time means I can't go into this, but it's all there in the article. So, in summing up to where I am at this, in this paper to this point, we are saying that behavioural choices around food and how to engage with food systems, I'm talking much more than food consumption, are largely the outcome of the structural forces, the socioeconomic and sociocultural forces I've been describing. But they can be modified through concerted and collective individual agency. So there is a role for individuals, but it has to be concerted and collective. And what we're seeing, the way we're seeing this, people's choices being played out, the most meaningful choices we have are those choices to become politically engaged. And those we do see with a lot of wonderful civil society organisations, particularly in this country, it's awesome for a visitor, is conflicts over what we would call the accumulation and distribution of structural resources. And those include not just financial wealth, but the protection of natural and biospherical resources, along with access to decision making. This is where individual choice making makes sense to us. And what Walls and I and the two others on the team argued is that these conflicts are going to increase. They are there now, but they are going to increase because of resource depletion in a context of global population growth. And we're arguing that already resource-poor groups are going to suffer the most, as I've said, and that inequities will grow. We illustrate this with these two people. The point of the two vignettes was we're finding it really hard to generalise globally about the situation. We had to take it back down to context-specific conditions within Australia. What were Peter's life chances and choices? Within Sri Lanka, what were Sita's life chances and choices? And so we do try and tease out those concepts in a meaningful way. I've already just pointed to this question that Colin Butler and some people are asking, and have we really reached the limits, not just of oil and nitrogen in the soil, etc. Actually, have we reached the limits of population health and well-being? Not, of course, for those at the top of the gradient. They could live to 110, but that's on the basis of resources denied to other people. What we are pointing out, that those value studies show that as resources, environmental resources become more and more scarce, the rules in society, whether Denmark, Australia, Pakistan, rules tighten for whole societies, and they could be rules imposed by the religious leaders or by the social democratic leaders. But as rules tighten for whole societies, given those gradients and the structural conditioning of our positioning in society, we're going to reproduce inequity and inequality. So, as rules tighten, there is this desire by people to leave these conditions, to fight these conditions. Now, the leaving the conditions we're seeing to do with boat people every day. I mean, people who can't make a living, who have no housing, who have no food, who have just access to disease, they're trying to escape. And what we're seeing is the biggest transnational movement of peoples in history. And then we're seeing the conflict day in, day out in the headlines in our papers. Who is faring worst at the moment? It is women, it is children, it is the elderly and the disabled. So where we end up with this in this article is, okay, public health has taught us about the social gradients in chance and choice, structure and agency. What have they said about where change comes from? And Helen Walls has written quite a lot about a century of improvements in public health. All the evidence points to the fact that it is elite-led It's generally the ruling class, often doctors. They may not feel like the ruling class anymore. But generally the picture is to protect their interest in face of working class revolt. Let's give a little. We'll be better off, but it's also to dampen conflict. But generally what it does do is to involve government or structures of power regulating in favour of positive changes for everyone, in providing, whether it's new sanitation, new forms of transport, food regulations, etc. But there's a conundrum here, and this gets to my heart of where change can come from in this doom and gloom scenario I'm painting. Those with the greatest ability to exercise agency, advantage groups, have the greatest ability to catalyse change, but the least to gain from it. So yes, we've got some wonderful instances of elite-led change that was partly to do with protecting themselves from violence and uprising, food riots, etc. But really the beneficiaries are not those agitating for the change in those instances. And now what we're asking of advantage groups in this new resource-constrained world, this is where we ended up. We have to vote to restrain our own wealth accumulation. We've got to deny ourselves. We have to curb our resource consumption. We have to vote for fair distributions of resources and hence privilege. And there's a piece in the paper that talks about enacting positive freedoms in social policy as opposed to enacting negative freedoms. Universal childcare, universal free education, healthcare, they're positive freedoms, as opposed to we'll take something off you if you don't immunise your children. This is a huge ask. But in the environmental justice space, this is the only place we can end up. That this is the circuit breaker. Now, how are people reacting? How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Is that it? Yeah. I'm notorious. This is a lovely, I'm not sure if Deborah talked about nutrition and biosensitive food projects in Africa, but World Fish, a body based in Penang, Malaysia, I heartily recommend if you're interested in food security that takes a nutrition and ecological coupling together to go onto their website. I've got one reference for you. They have been in Bangladesh in particular, but in other Asian countries, trying to intervene and to offer women a more potent role in fisheries production. But particularly aquaculture, where it is a growing market for aquaculture fish. They describe very briefly a wonderful intervention in 6 villages using different technologies that were basically conformed to climate-smart aquaculture, and then they evaluated who was taking up these technologies and what were the benefits. They were looking for nutritional benefits and for climate change mitigation benefits. However, their work, there's a very different report. It absolutely resonates with my conceptual article that I've just talked about. And it just talks in wonderful ways about women's socioeconomic positioning and also their cultural positioning. And so accepted gender roles meant that they did not have decision-making power, often, however, they did all the work unassisted. And then they talk about what constitutes success for a local intervention, gendered nutrition, eco-nutrition intervention. And here are some of the considerations. I'm sorry. And then I was going to blow it out again, but again, this stuff is readily available. I am having to critical nutrition is becoming quite a burgeoning field of study. We're all talking about the highly reductive nature of nutrition science and the way it is used and abused in social policy. And Julie Guthman's work I highly commend to you, and there was a special issue in Gastronomica in 2014. Again, the reference is there. Beautiful, beautiful papers talking about taking a critical nutrition position, looking at agri-food systems as a whole to the way we embody those nutrition ideals, the body beautiful, etc. Julie Guthman and others have pointed to the fact that we've got to think more overtly in terms of environmental justice and feminist justice. So this is where I'm going to end. Again, this paper by Erin Gilson comes out of the same special issue that our paper appears in. And it is a wonderful positioning of how food systems work against women because they are built on a dominant way of thinking, socio-culturally dominant ways of thinking about and dealing with vulnerability, dependency, and relationality. She said, instead, what we've done is we keep building food systems that are based on reductionist science, a detached view, a detachment from food, and a privatization. We are fearful of food. We think it is our fault. We're wonderful neoliberal subjects. We're saying we're making the wrong choices. We're always trying to find the right choice for our food activism or the food on our plate. But she says it's really hard to do because we inhabit this dominant way of thinking of dealing with some very fundamental things. So, what is she saying? The feminist concepts for food ethics. We have to adopt 3 new concepts and ways of thinking. What she calls intersubjective vulnerability. Rather than saying we're autonomous, we should actually acknowledge our frailty and that we don't know everything. And it's okay not to do anything, but we're going to work with others. We're going to also acknowledge that a dependency with those producing food, sharing food, enjoying food. And in a way, she returned in her last point to the social gradient and the unequal and unjust distribution of resources, that everything that we produce and consume has impacts across the social and biospheric systems. Yes, it is easier said than done, but I do actually think it is where civil society groups, non-government organisations, these for me are the principles that they're variously trying to bring together. And she just gave a piece of advice and said, if we do want to change the world in a way, if we want to change these systems of the dominant food systems, those gradients that come about through food systems, we've got to think and act in systems of relationality, and ask a question about all of humanity, all of human, animal species, nature, etc. Can we eat and live well together? So, from starting with doom and gloom, I think that we do have very, very powerful and potent ethical principles that can actually underpin the sort of activism, and here are the references. And I'm sorry to have attempted too much, but you'll be getting these. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite Kate Metcalf, second speaker, who is a local food project coordinator from the Women's Environmental Network, and she's going to talk about the Women's Environmental Network, which handily for us has had 25 years of ecofeminism in action, handy anniversary there. It's apparently the only organisation in the UK working consistently to make links between women's health and well-being and environmental issues. It formed in 1988, and they've brought a gendered analysis to environmental issues, but also broadened the scope of what is considered an environmental issue. And this talk will highlight in particular their work on gender and climate change, as well as their current local food work with ethnic minorities in Tower Hamlets in London.
Well, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. We've had quite a highbrow presentation, so I hope you're not going to find this one. This is more sort of mundane and lowbrow in action. So I'm from the Women's Environmental Network. We call it WEN for short, so just so you know. Actually, I said 25 years, but it's actually 28 years, but 25 years sounds better. It was actually founded by a group of women who were involved in the Green movement, who really felt that women's perspectives in the environmental movement were not being taken on board. So that's how WEN was really formed. Obviously there's been some progress, maybe not enough, but we're quite pleased to see that Friends of the Earth now have said that gender equality is going to be at the heart of their work, and they've recognised that that is then really important in terms of achieving environmental sustainability. We took part, they recently edited a book, Why Women Will Save the Planet. We've got a chapter on it, so if you're interested, there's a lot of academics contributing internationally and practitioners. So we're selling copies if you're interested. So this is our mission. We aim to make the connections between women's health, well-being and the environment. So that's our core mission. But we obviously got the practical side. We want to inspire women to make informed choices about their health and the environment. Obviously some high ideals here. We want them to become agents of change in their families, networks, societies, and participate equally in an environmental sustainable future. Not so easy to do in practice, but I'll show you how we've gone about it. So I know you've, in this whole series, discussed a lot about feminism and ecofeminism, so I'm not going to get involved in all the definitions. I think WEN has been seen as feminist and ecofeminist. So at the heart, we work for environmental justice through feminist principles. So for us, we don't really see how you can separate feminism and environmentalism, that you need to tackle them both at the same time. And it's not really desirable to have one without the other. So for us, the feminist approach, why we work in that way is just because it questions power, and that's essentially, whether we talk about the food system, climate change, that's what you really need to address. but also the link between the personal and political, which obviously feminists have always been talking about, so crucial as well for the environmental movement. What you do at home has an impact on the wider society. Okay, so since we've been formed, we've done a lot of campaigning work, but also sort of practical projects on the ground as well. So we did a lot of work on gender and climate change before it became really popular. Just raising awareness, what are some of the issues in developing countries and more industrialized countries. We worked on looking at breast cancer as an environmental disease, advocating really for a kind of precautionary approach to sort of chemicals, and sort of questioning what are the environmental factors that might contribute to the disease in terms of our water supply, exposure to toxic chemicals. We worked a lot on waste and looking at sort of the bleach in nappies and sanitary products. That was one of our first campaigns to get the chlorine out of sanitary products. So again, it has an environmental side to it, but also a health side when we're kind of ingesting these toxins into our body. And we were involved right at the word go with the GMOs. In terms of our workshops, we've had a lot of workshops on looking at the harmful chemicals in everyday cosmetics and makeup, and how it has more of an effect on women's bodies compared to men, compared to our biology, our hormonal changes. And then also, I suppose the feminist angle will be questioning all the pressures on women. Why do we need to use so many products as well? And then we did, part of those workshops, tried to provide alternatives, did fruity beauty workshops, so teaching people how to make your own natural cosmetics as well as using less. We set up Real Nappies for London and set up nationally Nappy Week, so promoting cloth nappies, the whole waste issue, and also reusable menstrual products. So really giving people the choice, maybe they don't really realise about some of the health and environmental issues. And I think with the whole environmental project, it was trying to get around the whole taboo around menstruation as well, that come on, we need to talk about this. And the most recently, I suppose, that links into this series, we've been doing a lot of work on food growing. I'll talk more about that in a minute and how that emerged. So our gender and climate change work, we worked with the WI back in 2007 and produced a women's manifesto on climate change. They did a whole survey of their members, obviously, they're across the country. So just asking them what policy changes they would like to see, what are some of the constraints that they're facing in terms of making environmental choices. So then we put it together into a manifesto and then presented it to policymakers. Then when the Copenhagen climate change talks, we then attended and got first-hand interviews, did a sort of gender monitoring of some of the key players who was involved in the negotiations and produced quite a long report. So we realised that a lot of people were not going to read that, so then we did a briefing, Why Women and Climate Change, just a 4-page briefing summarising some of the issues. But back in 2005, we produced a briefing, Why Women in the Environment, looking at all the issues, social inequality, women's roles, and how that has an impact. We've got copies of some of the briefings, or you can get them, download them for free from our website. So this is really, I'm going to talk more now about our whole local food programme. We're based in East London in Tower Hamlets. So we've got a number of strands in our local food work. But originally, the food programme started before it became very fashionable, really. I think that's the history of when we seem to be doing things early, but always struggling for funds. We were based right by an estate in Tower Hamlets, and a group of Bangladeshi women from the estate opposite came to our help to ask us to set up a kind of community garden on their estate. So we helped them negotiate land with their social landlord, and it sort of took off from there. So when we started providing training for these women. They were mainly Bangladeshi. A lot of them were very isolated, living in their flats. They didn't have an opportunity to come out, so it was a great way for them to gain confidence and do something they were really comfortable with. So from there, there were a lot of requests to do training. So we then did this training called Spice It Up. So it was organic food growing training for women in East London. From all of the community gardens we were working with, then we started to form the Tower Hamlets Food Growing Network, bringing all the gardens together into events. And then also the seed library. I'll talk more about that. Okay. So yeah, why are we focusing on food growing? You've probably touched on it in all the seminars, but for us, it's been a really good way to sort of address environmental issues in a very concrete way. Because sometimes if you think, how can you talk about climate change? People don't know really where to start. So we've engaged people in a practical way doing training. But through that, we then talk about wider environmental issues at our network events. And we try to also kind of promote and make them feel really good about what they're doing has an impact. So if you're composting, if you're saving seeds, this actually has an impact. Mainly working with Black, Asian and minority ethnic women in Tower Hamlets, that's the main population. A lot of the women come from rural backgrounds in Bangladesh and then living in a concrete jungle. So it's a really nice way for them to have a link back to their home country and then growing food. And this has been really good because a lot of them have got absolute expert knowledge in terms of growing, but not necessarily the best at English. So it's been a kind of, how can we get them to share their knowledge with the wider group? I say here it's like a covert feminist approach, and that might sound a little bit sneaky, but I think with the people we work with, you can't just say, launch in there, say, hi, we're feminists and this is what we want to do. So we've sort of take people more on a journey. It's quite a slow process. A lot of people were quite shy to speak up in a group at first, or just coming out the house was quite a big deal. The health and well-being angle has come out quite strongly in our local food work. That people really benefited from the whole mental health, well-being connection with others. I shouldn't look up there, I should look here. Yeah, and I think food is just brilliant in terms of everybody eats, so people could grow different crops that could express their cultural heritage and then talk about that. And we tried to create forums where we could then share that. And obviously, in our Spice It Up, we promote organic food, and there's a kind of I suppose there's kind of perception that organic food's only for rich people. So we've tried to say, well, actually, if you grow your own, we believe it's a basic right for everybody to have healthy food, and it's actually cheaper to grow organic food. So trying to reverse that. So this is a little bit more details about our Spice It Up. It's an introductory free course. We do a level 1 and then a level 2. We use participatory methods to try and involve people, so different sort of techniques so people can get involved even if they're not literate. We've got a lot of visual things where people can share pictures and stories. We do drama, role plays, looking at sort of power dynamics with food and the people's histories. And we found that people have really valued this sort of experience and this way of learning. A lot of the people we work with, they've got a lot of barriers to accessing more formal training, so this is a very good way in and trying to value their knowledge. Some of them, we've had women-only sessions because some would not come to a mixed group, but we've also ran some mixed ones as well. This is just some of the gardens, all the different places we've gone to. So this is the Tower Hamlets Food Growing Network. It's growing all the time. We've got a lot of support from the social landlords because they see it as a great way to engage their residents. A lot of residents don't come along to these tenants meetings. They find it quite boring, but they will get involved in a community garden. So we have the talks on some international issues as well, invite speakers in. We do a tour of a local community garden. We have a resource directory, and the seed library is very popular, so people can get free seeds, and hopefully the idea is they donate back, but that's a long way off for some people, I think. So with the gatherings are held at different places around the borough to involve as many people as possible. And normally about 100 to 140 people come to each gathering, different groups. I say it's a pretty diverse group. Men are welcome to come along as well. It's not a women-only space. With a local lead for capital growth in Tower Hamlets, so if people want to find a local community garden, they can go on their website, type in their postcode, and then see about volunteering. Some more of our events. We've held them on the city farms, at community centres, in markets, different places to engage as many people as possible, really. If you walk, a lot of people have said they've walked into these events and they wouldn't be able to say, oh, what's this event about? Because they're literally people of all ages, all different cultural backgrounds, and all there with the shared interests. So in that way, I think the food growing and food is a really unifying way to work with people. So this is our seed library. These are some of the aims to try and challenge the power of Monsanto and some of that whole side in a very small, practical way. We're hoping it's going to take off further. We've teamed up with Spitalfields Farm. They're going to having an actual physical library on their farm as well. So our one's more mobile, we take to events, but we're working in partnership with them, and they're working with Queen Mary University to, when the people donate the seeds, they will then get the stories of where the seeds have grown, what are the conditions, and trying. So if people come and get the seeds, they don't just get a packet of seeds, they might then hear someone how they grew the seed, how they save the seed, just to make it a little bit more interactive. Last year we were commissioned by Tower Hamlets Public Health to set up 15 new community gardens in the borough. So they commissioned this work from a health and well-being perspective. They really saw the benefits. We mainly work with registered providers. So that was quite different in a way. We went to estates and we engaged with different residents, some who were a lot more isolated, who were only on their estates, and they engaged because they had a growing box right there. So yeah, a real range of different gardens. We also worked in community centres, some women's centre, one hostel and a library. So yeah, some of the impact, was mainly the health and well-being. But I mean, obviously there was a big sort of gender angle for us with that in terms of women's health and well-being, which they've got quite bad mental health statistics in Sowing Hamlets, particularly for certain groups of women. So that, I think, was very successful in the project in terms of engaging them. But we also then linked them into the Tower Hamlets Food Growing Network, so it wasn't a standalone project. We encouraged them to come to events, so it was kind of an ongoing engagement. One man said, just from this one box here in the picture, he said he hadn't bought any extra vegetables apart from one cabbage for 3 months, so that was interesting. But there again, he said his wife was really the expert grower, but she wouldn't come to a lot of the events, which was quite, even though we were encouraging, it did a lot for her health. So that was still another challenge. So we provide ongoing support where we can. The demand outstrips our capacity to support, unfortunately. There's so many gardens, they want training and support. So just looking for where we're sort of heading. In terms of the food growing work, we're looking to take it into women's refuges. So really looking at a sort of therapeutic horticulture, food, the whole aspect, and a good way to sort of engage them in a practical growing, sort of healing, and maybe children can get involved as well. We're working with the city farms to form this green partnership, working with people with more severe mental health problems who would get prescribed with their community mental health team to go and work in sort of green care. So really looking at that as a way, rather than you might get antidepressants, this is another option that you could do. We're hoping to reinvigorate our environmental project, which we were working on in the past, going into schools and hopefully working with the Girl Guides to take these issues forward. And another possible is a sustainable fashion project, which then links back to organic cotton and the whole soil as a way to engage women perhaps, and also hear what they could do. So that's our vision of an environmental sustainable world in which we've achieved gender equality. And as I mentioned, funding is an ongoing crisis for women's organisations and small organisations. So if you would like to join us or know anyone who would, you'd be very welcome. We've got packs today, but you can join online. We've got a short film which shows, I think, a little bit more in detail of some of the gardens. Have we got time to show it, do you think? Okay.
The Women's Environmental Network is the only organisation in the UK that has worked consistently to make the links between women's health and well-being and environmental issues. And we're working for environmental justice through feminist principles.
We've raised awareness about the gender implications of climate change. Women are more affected by climate change due to gender inequality. They've contributed less to it and are not involved equally in solutions to tackle it.
We've also broadened the scope of what's considered an environmental issue, such as menstrual health, real nappies and breast cancer.
Our vision is of an environmentally sustainable world in which we've achieved gender equality, and we believe that one is not possible or desirable without the other. That's where WEN comes in. We want to involve women, empower them to be involved in climate change decisions and solutions on the ground.
We educate people about how to live more sustainably, so we're thinking globally but acting locally. How can people grow more of their own organic food, composting, so reducing household waste, real nappies, reducing the amount of chemicals they intake through cosmetics, how they can make their own natural products instead. At a grassroots level, we work with different community centres and community gardens throughout East London, running training on different topics from food growing to seed saving and composting. But we also run events that bring everyone together from different cultural backgrounds to share knowledge and resources and seeds.
Every year they all meet together and cook together and provide each other help.
WEN came to visit our garden and they organised the courses from our local community centre.
The message is about using the environment, using the land, don't waste it.
WEN encouraged me to ask my landlord for raised beds to grow my own vegetables.
I can grow food and I get crops.
We really believe that environmentalism is a feminist issue, and equally feminism is also an environmental issue, and they should be tackled together.
It has helped me to be more conscious about our environment.
We want to inspire women to make environmentally informed choices, and we want to empower them to become agents of change and participate equally in an environmentally sustainable future.
It changes people. It makes such a difference. It does.
It's helped to make me a happier person.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Kate. I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about your covert feminist approach for WEN, but also how it works with your projects and how it develops with time when you're working with women and men.
approach more in our food work, just recognising the sort of communities we're working in. I think the idea is it becomes less covert and you introduce the concepts perhaps in a more subtle way. So we would introduce the issues, but we wouldn't say, hello, we're feminists. But actually we're thinking of perhaps being more overt. But I think, depending which audience we're talking with as well. But it's very slow, it's slow work in terms of engaging with a certain group and how long they take to feel confident with you, or coming to events. I mean, a lot of groups, they wouldn't come to events unless we accompanied them there, or wouldn't go if it was a mixed group with men. Now they feel quite comfortable in those settings. So so if you then said, hello, I'm a feminist, or it might put them off using those terms, but how we work as well, I suppose, would be, because we're making them feel more confident, and hopefully that is a feminist approach.
I'm not really going to answer that question in the same way, but that example from Bangladesh showed that if the instigators of those two interventions, one was a cage system that could be moved up and down river containing fish, and the other was a much more bulky system of growing. It was fixed but harder for women to get into and physically handle. One of those points on the slide that I didn't get to talk to said that having evaluated the success of both interventions in 6 villages, they felt strongly that they had to work with men and women in the households, that at least in the early stages, I'm reading between the lines of this bit, but they had to explain fully to both that this was a women's project, but they had to both be involved. And in some cases, the men had to do the more physical labour, but it was in terms of decision making, who should be making decisions at which point, particularly about financial upgrading of the technology. So I'm just wondering, Kate, in terms of the covert feminist approach, are there situations when it's important to work with both men and women in order for the women to be given the opportunities?
It's not our aim to always have women-only sessions. I think that's just being practical at the moment, but I think the aim would be to have mixed sessions, and yes, definitely to work with men.
Yes.
But funnily enough, one garden, the initial garden of the Bangladeshi women who came together, once they had organised and got the garden, the men then said, oh, we want a garden. So it was, then once they'd seen the women had got it, and then it was like almost like a battle over space of who's going to get more space. They didn't want to give it up, but yeah. But I think the difference was the men had access to that public space. They were going to the mosque, they were meeting, whereas the women didn't. So it was more important for them to claim that public space. So in that sense, yes, sorry.
I think we have a couple more questions. One at the back, or was there another one? On there. Okay, we'll take 3.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the presentations. Nice to hear about Wen's work, and I wasn't really familiar with the literature that comes from the more kind of population, public health perspective on some of these things, so that's really useful. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, maybe something that we can engage in dialogue about with others here, but I guess I'm sort of troubled in some ways by the ways in which whiteness is operating in these food spaces, and I think also perhaps in this room. And I just thought maybe we could spend some time reflecting about also the kind of colonial history that kind of women's involvement in sort of proselytizing good food has in different contexts. So kind of thinking about how bringing good food to others from Julie Guthman's work is kind of perhaps at work in some of the projects that we might be involved with, and how we might want to think about that, or how we might try to account for that in the different kinds of work we do. So I'd be curious.
Okay, it's a big question, but we'll take
More interesting question than mine. Sorry. Mine was a question for Jane, and I may have misunderstood this, but at one point I think you said that as resources become constrained, more constrained, rules tighten. And I wondered, that's what you said. Is that what you? I wondered if you could talk about that. I mean, is that based on a piece of empirical research that has been observed to happen? And I think we can certainly see that in this country, because as we face migration, a kind of perceived threat from migration, we worry about our scarce resources, and so we try to make rules about that. But I also wonder whether a different thing is just, rather than rules tightening, it focuses distributional rules which could change, not necessarily tighten, but just change, so that resource constraint could have the effect of necessitating a more equitable distribution within a fixed set of resources.
Okay. And then there's one more.
Mine's really simple. It was just a follow-on from what you were just talking about, and about the involvement of men. And you said that the projects are open to men to attend, and I just wondered, given that your initial focus was on women, has there been a tendency for sort of men to start taking over any of the sites, or is that something that's difficult to manage, because you want to probably be inclusive and achieve outcomes, but still sort of focus on your original audience? I'm wondering if that's a problem.
Okay, so I think we had 3 questions there. One about race and sort of colonial aspect of all of this. The second one about rules and tightening of constraints on resources. And then the third one just about men in your projects. Jane, do you want to go first?
Colonial history. Are you, no, I would like to ask for some clarification. Are you saying particular colonial histories actually set up gender demarcations about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate?
I guess what I was referring to more there has to do with, I guess, the history in which white women are often implicated in colonial projects by sort of acting as go-betweens or missionaries for particular ideas. And so this kind of idea of good food, right? Julie Guthman's article of bringing good food to others, I think women play quite a strong role in that, especially, white women in particular, in certain areas. And it can be different kinds of food, but I think the idea of nutritional health and all these kinds of discourses, women are often at the forefront of that, and so I think that's kind of a complex set of things to untangle, so I'd just be curious to hear thoughts.
Hugely complex. I do think that Erin Gilson makes the point that we can criticise existing food relations, who's doing what, who's got the say, whether it's men, whether it's women, ruling class, working class, etc., etc. Or we can say, let's be cultural relativists and say, for that group, let's suspend critique, even if it's friendly critique, and say that's the way it has operated in that society for that group for centuries. Let's respect that. So I think there is a tussle between an almost libertarian cultural relativism, that just because a particular group has always done this in this way, let's respect that, swinging to another pole, which is that sort of missionary intervention, we know what's best for you. And so I know my answer is a cop-out, because I say there's somewhere in between, that there has to be a negotiated. The way I can make this most concrete is, for example, the issue of whale hunting, seal hunting, kangaroo hunting in the Australian situation, where we will say, just because that's traditional, and it means a lot to those people to operate in those ways, outsiders shouldn't intervene. And so I just think there are some very complex moral dilemmas for everybody involved in terms of trying to understand what is happening with intervening and why. But I think part of the question is an excellent one in terms of just saying we do have to interrogate the power in the intervention and why people are making the judgments they're making.
Kate, do you have a comment? Working at the kind of coalface of those sorts of issues.
Yeah, I think we are questioning those things a lot. I think in working with I suppose we're trying to reverse those sort of issues where trying to say we've actually got more to learn from you. That's what we found in most of our courses. We're not there teaching. Actually, we want to learn, and we're sharing the knowledge because we have that existing knowledge, particularly. So we've really tried to value that and recognise that. I mean, it's a bit different. We're not going in with a health message. We enable them to do what they want to do. So that sense, you know, they want to grow food. How can we make it happen? So it's a little bit different. We have worked a lot with Tower Hamlets Public Health, though. So they've got a whole sort of agenda. But then again, they found food growing a better way to engage people. Don't go in and lecture about this is what you should eat. Actually, just encourage people to get involved, start growing food. Don't even talk along those lines. But I don't know whether they've interrogated it in those terms of colonial. I mean, it's a very mixed team in Tower Hamlets Council, but obviously they're still British and got educated in the system with that thinking. So yeah.
And would you like to say a bit more about to answer the question here?
Yes, I think that's a key point, and we've when we've had the network, we wanted to make it open, the Tower Hamlets Food Growing Network. I mean, it's saying that is still dominated by women. Most of the courses are women, but I have to say, maybe it's a type of men we've been quite lucky, or the style of teaching, because it is always a tendency for that. There's always a tension that maybe men can take over. You want men as allies as well. But mind you, there are women who dominate as well. So, you know, so you want to be totally rigid. But I have to say, I suppose maybe because we've been aware of that, we haven't had that experience. But we will be have that in mind to not allow that to happen. If we've got speakers, we make sure there's a good mix, or who's talking. So yeah, no.
And maybe that question about the tightening of rules.
Oh yes, you can deal with that.
It is based on, there are two citations, but I'll have to give you, one is Gelfand, and it's in the article. The other is from the World Values Survey, but it's Gelfand who actually said that, and it's on the slide as tightness of societal norms are proportional to per capita level of economic resources available. It was a very sophisticated cross-national database that was used for this. When resources decline, tightness follows and freedoms decline. So, yeah. It is that piece of evidence is about in the main those who fear that their access to resources are going to be curtailed in any way will fight to maintain their access to those resources, and they will do so through whether it's government regulation or policy or legal dictate. I think examples there might be land use. And in the Australian instance, for example, we are now not allowing foreign owners to buy up the farm. We have been for several years, but there have just been some celebrated cases where the Foreign Investment Review Board has said, no, that land's too valued, that's in the national interest. The rules have tightened. Now, look, I do imagine, I mean, it would be wonderful to think under resource constraint, where in fact we have to say, well, in protecting vested interests, vested access to resources, that has had its day. I mean, we can't continue on like that. And in fact, we've got to change the way we think about land tenure, for example. And I think some countries are starting to do that. We have got to think about access to the seas in different ways. So I think the International Tribunal on the Seas, etc., is starting to think about those marine environments in different ways. So I would love it if, in fact, the direction in which you are headed will actually gain momentum, and what Gefland and colleagues are saying actually is almost a self-defeating position to be in.
Thank you. Any further questions? I had one to follow up that, Jane. Does that, the implication of that is then that women will be further down the heap in terms of the tightening of the rules? And that was a sort of almost an unspoken in your talk. You talked a lot about inequality, and perhaps not so much about where women then stand. Do you feel that all women are further down, or there are groups of women that are, is that part of your continuum?
What was devilishly hard about writing the article, and what I think is devilishly hard about any narrative based on the global, the international, is that you are glossing national and subnational specificity and the particular cultural meanings. That's why we chose in our small group to think about Australian society and Sri Lankan society and to say, well, actually, how would these concepts play out differently, and would women be affected differently? Interestingly, for the Sri Lankan example, which was workshopped between, this woman went back to Sri Lanka and workshopped her vignette with her mother and a coterie of women. They actually all said, under resource constraints, we believe that women, Sri Lankan women, many Sri Lankan women, would be better off in Sri Lanka than they will be in Australia. So Australia's got a good welfare safety net, but they felt that they were going to be looked after by their community, that there was going to be a lot more social provisioning, care, etc., because of a very different culture about possession and resource distribution and how resources are used. In the Australian instance, we're talking about, we're talking about what's happening to Peter's children in Australia, the 78-year-old, and Sita, 81, and her children and grandchildren, And Peter's children, the baby boomer generation in Australia, have done very nicely, thank you, my generation, out of resource richness and the particular economic trajectory Australia has been on. But resources are now tightening in Australia in terms of livelihoods, jobs, home ownership. And actually we ended up, the Australian vignette, in quite a bleak place, that with the end of, we didn't mention it, but with the end of the mining boom and our natural resource richness, we've plundered it to such an extent. Our agricultural lands are so poor now that if fossil fuels become more expensive and all the inputs to agriculture become more expensive, more and more farmers will commit suicide, they will walk off the land. So that is one scenario. In Sri Lanka, the scenario was painted differently. The good times have never been that good. They've just come through a horrendous civil war. But at the same time, these older Sri Lankan women were saying, well, we would prefer our grandchildren in a resource-constrained world to be in Sri Lanka. Now, you know, we could each take a country that we're familiar with or know a little bit and paint a different scenario. So it is very hard to generalise the way whether rules will tighten, loosen, what leverage points there are over the rule-making apparatus, and how they will play out for women. So again, another cop-out answer, but it does show how important actually on-the-ground ethnographic research is, and hearing this wonderful case example, I do think ethics, the field of moral philosophy, it does operate so much on the abstract, and it's very important in that way, but in helping us to judge rightness, wrongness, good, bad, our place in all of that. But at the end of the day, unless you understand the context, it's very hard to say what is right or wrong. Or
Can I ask you one more question? You said at the beginning that you had some reservations about some of the civil society, some of the work that civil society was doing, or you had some argument, or did I misunderstand you? With perhaps some of the things that groups like Kate's group were doing, and you were hoping to be proved wrong. Could you expand on that a little bit?
No,
It's okay.
my reservation is no, not with what Kate's group or other groups are doing individually. It's that we've been having this debate for 30 or 40 years. It is, how do we join up all those local initiatives to that hideous phrase, scale up. What does scale up mean, Kate? How do we scale up, amplify that effort? And I know clearly you're doing something right because you're being asked to scale out at the very, so many more gardens, you can't meet the demand. But how do we get that into the all-party committee in Parliament on food and farming that I attended with Mary and others. How do we talk about how do we connect the dots between what is happening in food systems, food access, low-income communities, to things like the living wage, to your Trans-Pacific, TTIP. We've got TPPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. How do we join the dots in my talk between the social gradients of health, a local intervention in Bangladesh, what's happening in Tower Hamlets, then with actually questioning the whole moral foundation of decision making. So that's my reservation, and I know that we have been grappling with it. I keep looking at Martin. We old timers have been grappling with this for decades. Since the women's movement, we have a second wave of the women's movement. We have been saying how the personal is political, but sometimes that is a slogan. The local and the global attend to both. That can become a slogan. So then so I do actually see a role then for social movements as something much bigger, and whether it's the Soil Association and the organics movement as a national movement that helps to join up the dots to Parliament. Now, whether it's good enough, I don't know. The peasants' movement, Via Campesina, it has had some influence over key food and agriculture organisation structures, and it has dealt peasants' groups into the thinking of FAO. But that can become a very bloody business in terms of the tactics and strategies that are used and alienate people in local communities, and most people don't even know that that's happening. So, in Gilson's term, that is detached activity in a way. But we do have to think about the mobilising strategies and vehicles that link the local to the global, and trying to change the rules of the game so tightness doesn't necessarily follow resource constraints, but an openness can follow.
Okay, do you have anything to add to that? Can you scale up?
We'd love to scale up if we had the... I think looking much more towards that partnership, working with the bigger players and working, I think there is a shift now to be obviously resources, there's a lot less funding, so people are looking to work more in collaboration, but I think there's a shift in approach as well. Perhaps with the whole Naomi Klein, this changes everything, to get inviting people, environmentalists, everyone broaden out, make alliances with different groups, unions, women's groups, come together, what have you got in common, I think. I'm hopeful. Well, obviously it's not an easy task, let's be honest, but I think in general the thinking within the environmental sector is a lot more alliance building, hopefully. So, yeah.
And do you see further sort of movements, feminist movements? You said that you're the only one.
Yeah, we just see a kind of resurgence in the feminist. We felt quite lonely for a long time, but now we're getting a lot of interest of people. Young people coming through, they're feminists, yet they also got an environmental consciousness and they want to get involved, and that is really great, I think. And to see the likes of Friends of the Earth recognising that as well. So, and they've got quite a lot of influence in terms of they're all over the country, all over the world, so that would be good. So.
Any further questions? Yes, go for it.
Just for Jane, really, what do you think academia's role in that process is?
It's a
quick one there. A quick answer.
Oh, okay.
You can use that. You're on.
Oh.
There's a related one next to it.
Oh, okay.
If someone works for a larger NGO, I wanted to ask them, what do you think our role is? Because I feel like we're thinking a lot, okay, it's about alliance building, it's about how do you support smaller NGOs, but there's always a tension and risk of gulfing other initiatives. So.
I think that is the key, having worked in a large NGO and a smaller one, I can see both perspectives. I think that is the danger of the large organisations. I mean, they can pay that sort of global corporate, and sort of the brand is more important rather than the work, or rather than actually, I think the role of large organisations is actually to support the smaller groups, not to take over, let them keep their own identity, actually support them, and you could work in a proper partnership, which is difficult when you've got different resources, but maybe you can both play to your strengths and don't feel you have to take over. As well, I would say that would play out in other ways, like other big companies don't have to then take over smaller ones. I've seen that has happened in the fair trade movement as well. Sorry, you can answer the other question. Oh, sorry.
I'm not just saying this because Martin and the Centre for Food Policy put me forward for this Leverhulme Trust professorship. But I actually think the Centre for Food Policy is your answer. The reason I've actually been visiting since about 2009, the centre off and on, and truly the alliance building, that whether it's the food research collaboration or it's now this expanded network, the IFSTAL network, don't ask me to spell it out. It's alliance building with other NGOs. It's putting together submissions to government inquiries. It's putting the Learned Academy out there. It is taking a stance on particular issues. It's not self-censoring. This might harm our prospects of future funding, etc. I just find it takes a good quality of scholarship and it applies it through various networks. I was really thrilled to be a part of the launch of the Square Meal Diet report, but in 2013 or 14. And that was just a wonderful example of what an academic centre could do in forming an alliance with the Bird Society and the National Trust and these other venerable organisations. So the Centre for Food Policy is, in my experience, quite a unique body from an Australian perspective. What we as academics do is generally we don't go any further than being an expert witness or putting in a submission to a government inquiry. We generally don't front non-government organisations or civil society groups. We might be a member of those in a private capacity. I just find that this joint role of academic, having a deep knowledge of something in a conceptual and applied sense, but then feeling it is your duty to get it out there is just a marvellous experience, and the reason I'm loving being here.
Yeah, I'll just say from a NGO perspective, we would really welcome more links with academia and really value their support, because often we don't have the time to do that in-depth sort of analysis which you kind of need to do the policy work, the campaigning. So it would be very useful to have much closer links, and they could really provide that support, which would be excellent. That time for sort of reflection and really in-depth, so it's really robust sort of analysis.
Are there any more questions?
Can I please ask a question?
Yeah. Please, you've got your microphone.
Can I ask a question of you? And you look so crestfallen at our answers. I would like to hear what you're thinking about the question you asked.
Well, to be fair, I think I just have that face generally. No, I appreciate your engagement, actually. I appreciate everyone's responses. I think it's something that I'm thinking about in my own work. I'm from Hawaii, so I'm from a kind of a settler colonial society in which we have very active indigenous rights movements. And so I'm researching food movements there, and it's things that I come across frequently insofar as our food movements are largely protagonized by, well, an interesting array of people, many of whom are older white women from that have kind of settled in Hawaii around the 60s or 70s. And so it's just kind of interesting for me, I guess, looking at that for my own work and then identifying as well as a white woman and thinking, like, how is it that new generations of, like, ecofeminists who may or may not identify with that title, I certainly don't, I definitely identify with the feminist title, but just not the ecofeminist part. And I think there's a lot of colonialism and a lot of imperialist feminism that's gone on under the name of sort of ecofeminism and allied efforts in certain, not only food movements, but in other kind of allied projects. So it's more just like crestfallen because it's upsetting, right? This is, people are involved in trying to think about social justice and food justice. And yet for me personally, and I know a lot of people have written about this, Breeze Harper, Rachel Slocum, Julie Guthman obviously, have been talking a lot about this and the ways in which, food projects, in some ways it's nice, some of the things that come out, because it's like, yes, people want to support it because it's easy, it's accessible. But for those very same reasons, it's so amenable to being co-opted. And I think a lot of the framing and a lot of the questions for me are depressing, because it reminds me of that continual co-option of, like, oh, it needs to be scaled up, or oh, like, government might support it if it's this way, or this kinds of agendas which really don't emerge from engaging with the structural conditions of food systems or workers' movements or farmers or peasants' movements. So I guess it's that probably a shared frustration. Thank you for the feedback.
Any comments, Jane?
Well, I quoted the special issue from Gastronomica, edited by Julie Guthman, 2014, devoted to what is critical nutrition. And several of those papers, an article I've written, an article that many, lots of other lovely pieces, are perhaps talking to your point when you trace the history of nutrition science and you trace how it was used and abused at the turn of the 20th century through home economics and then nutrition and dietetics. I'm a social worker by training, so I know, this is where what you're saying resonates so much, that we take the available science, we don't interrogate where it has come from, in whose interest, who's funded it, why it is there, why the questions were being posed, and we take those answers into households, and we either talk about healthy cooking or parenting skills, and there are a lot of blind spots. So certainly the whole field of critical nutrition is a wonderful questioning of what are the implications of this robust evidence base, how is it being used, how can we think about nutrition differently, what is lay knowledge, do we have to have it all in the laboratory, etc., etc. So, a very important corrective. in terms of intervening.
Okay, well, I think we've probably, unless anybody has any more burning questions, I think we've come to the end. And thank you all very much for coming, and special thanks to Jane and to Kate for coming, giving up their time to talk to us.